consider the case where the firm uses its market power, in other words, its ability to set price in the market, to discriminate between customers. In other words, to charge different prices to different people. Before we do that though, let's just consider the single price strategy. Let's just review that. In the case where the firm charges just a single price, we saw that it was desirable for the firm to sell an amount only up to this point here, where the additional revenues that it gets, its marginal revenue, is just counterbalanced by its marginal cost. In this simple case, I've just assumed that marginal costs are constant, but the same argument would hold if marginal costs were increasing. So the firm is going to lower its price and add to its sales and add to its revenues, as illustrated by this line, up until this point here. At that point, it's going to charge the highest price that it can get, that price there, and that leaves the consumers with a certain amount of consumer surplus. And we saw the argument that that was inefficient from a social point of view because the additional benefits, the marginal benefits that people could get from this good exceeded its marginal costs, and yet the monopolist was not willing to produce that because that would not maximize profits. So we saw the argument that there was a loss of surplus shown by this triangle that I'm outlining here. Well, let's consider the case where the firm doesn't charge just a single price, but charges a different price to different people. So this is called price discrimination, and it is simply defined as a situation where different people are charged different prices for exactly the same product. So it's important to note that those price differences don't reflect cost differences. If they did, they'd really be being sold a different product. That's why it would involve a different cost. If you think about examples, they're really all around us, as we'll see when we look at the examples a little bit later on. We can classify price discrimination as taking a number of different forms. Perhaps the most extreme form is one in which individuals are charged different prices. So everybody pays a different price. That's the case of perfect price discrimination. So as we'll see, that's a case in which the seller is attempting to guess or estimate the maximum willingness to pay that each customer might have and would try to set the price accordingly. Well, generally firms don't have that much information about people, so they might set up a situation where individuals are offered choices, and by the choices that people make, they reveal to the seller what their willingness to pay is. On the other hand, it may be that sellers might be able to make some guess about how much people would be willing to pay based on observable characteristics. So you might see that some customers are children, some are old people, some are adults, some might be students, and so on. And so you might be able to offer different prices on that basis. Well, let's start with the first case, the case where each individual might, at least in principle, be charged a different price. A classic case like this is the prices that would be paid in a place like this souk or market in Marrakesh in Morocco, as illustrated in the photograph. So if you were to go to a market like this, you would find that there were no price tags on anything. Every price has to be negotiated individually with each seller. So in that situation, everybody can possibly pay a different price. Nobody has any idea what other people have paid. Of course, if you're a tourist in a tourist trap like this, you're undoubtedly going to pay way too much for anything that you buy because you have no idea the prices that the individual sellers are really willing to accept. Locals and repeat customers are going to end up getting better prices because they're going to have a much better knowledge of the market. So how could we think about that theoretically? Well, let's imagine the most extreme case in which the seller is successful in charging each customer their marginal benefit or their actual maximum willingness to pay. If that was the case, then the sellers would be charging a separate price to every customer as reflected by the demand curve, and the consumer surplus that the buyers would have otherwise received has now become producer surplus. Another feature of this situation is that the demand curve actually reflects the marginal revenue that the sellers are getting. That's true because in order for a seller to sell a little bit more, now they don't have to lower the price on what they were selling before, as they did in the case where there was only a single price. So now they can sell a little bit more, and the addition to their revenue is simply the price that they're getting. So the demand curve in this very special case becomes the marginal revenue curve, and the seller is going to find it profitable to expand sales all the way up until marginal revenue is just equal to marginal cost. So the logic, the reasoning of profit maximization is the same here as we saw before, but in this special case, because everybody gets charged a separate price, we're going to end up with this quantity being sold. So compared to the earlier case that we saw where there was just a single price, you can see that much more is being sold. So let's just compare those two pricing strategies, the single price with perfect price discrimination. So if this is the single price, we saw that before the buyers were able to get this amount of consumer surplus, as shown by the dark green triangle. And as I mentioned before, this blue triangle here was effectively lost surplus from a social point of view because the sellers were not willing to produce and sell beyond that point. Why not? Well, because marginal revenue and marginal cost were just equal here. To sell any more beyond that meant that marginal costs would be exceeding marginal revenues, and that would not be profitable for the seller. However, in the case of perfect price discrimination, we saw that it's possible to expand sales all the way up to this point here. And the result ends up being that the seller can get additional profit, not only by capturing the consumer surplus, because now each of these buyers is paying a higher price than they did before, but the seller is also willing to expand sales all the way up to this point, and that additional revenue from those additional sales in excess of marginal costs is adding to the seller's profits. So, rather surprisingly, in this case, we end up with an efficient outcome. But it's an outcome in which the seller captures all of the surplus. Well, let's just consider an example that, while not perfect price discrimination, is at least an attempt to do this. Let's consider what's charged to students at what are called Ivy League universities, the big private universities in the United States. Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut is a good example. If you go to their website, you will see that the official tuition prices this year are $55,540 US. And if you were going to be a student there and you were going to live in residence, it would cost you another $16,600 for room and board and for the books that you would require for your courses. So in other words, a total of $72,140 would be the official price. Well, is that actually what all students are going to pay? And the answer is no, because in effect discounts can be offered to individual students so that potentially at least everyone pays a different price. So how does this price discrimination take place? Well, what happens is that individual students who are looking for what's called need-based aid have to supply very detailed information about the finances of their parents. So they have to reveal everything that their parents own, what they do, what their income is, and so on. And that allows the university to try and figure out what the maximum price is that they would be willing to charge. So people who come from rich families like this fellow here, you may recognize the young George W. Bush, former president of the United States, came from a very rich family. He would not get any discount, but some people might be awarded some financial aid on the basis of need. And according to the Yale website, that scholarship can vary from a few $100s to over $70,000 per year. Well, this is just a way of saying that everybody can be effectively given a different discount from this very high price. And so different people are being charged different amounts. They claim that the average scholarship is over $50,000. Incidentally, there are no merit-based scholarships, so if you're a really good student, that doesn't matter. You would have to look for other sources of financial aid. Well, what I'm going to consider in the next video are different kinds of price discrimination, other than this attempt at perfect price discrimination.